Meet Koji Igarashi, a man considered by many to be one of the fathers of the modern Metroidvania.
こんばんは、五十嵐浩二です。
This man is credited as the brains behind the critically acclaimed cult classic Castlevania Symphony of the Night and the similarly styled Castlevania titles that came afterwards, most notably on the Game Boy Advance and the Nintendo DS. This man was so influential in the Metroidvania genre that, in addition to being responsible for one of the two games that makes up the portmanteau of Metroidvania, he also has a very specific style of the genre that is named right after him, the Igavania. Technically, this is a subgenre within another subgenre that's in a genre itself, but it makes sense if you look closely enough. An Igavania has all of the normal trappings of a Metroidvania, but with a few defining features such as an experience-based level-up system, a somewhat complicated inventory system, various different weapon types to choose between and master, and it might even include a gothic or medieval-inspired art style, or at least something reminiscent of that. And finally, a variety of sub-weapons or magic is a very important aspect of these games. For a good example of what an Igavania-style game looks like outside of the Castlevania series itself, I think Chasm, despite my lukewarm reception of it, and Timespinner, which I think is a pretty fantastic game, will both give you a pretty good idea of what to expect from the genre. 2008 was the last time that we got a proper Castlevania game from Igarashi himself, and it wasn't until 2015 that fans of these games would finally be teased with the next installment, albeit in an unofficial capacity. Bloodstained Ritual of the Night hit Kickstarter and was an immediate success, blowing its $500,000 goal out of the water to the tune of over $5.5 million. Whew, that's a lot of money. Anyway, let's stop beating around the bush. I know some of you may have hate-clicked this video, eager to either tell me how wrong my opinions are or to otherwise hear why my reception of such an overwhelmingly well-received game was so lukewarm. And I want to be clear from the outset, I don't hate Bloodstained, nor do I think it's outright bad. Because of that, more than any other video I've ever made for this channel, the script for this one was by far the most difficult for me to put together. I'm trying to write a line here, but know that I'm going to offer a lot of critique to this game, and also know that it comes from a place of care. Of care about the genre, care about the game, and a desire to see the formula improved on in the future. Bloodstained is a spiritual successor to Symphony of the Night in every sense of the phrase, and to diehard fans of that game, Bloodstained is probably everything they ever wanted from an Igavania in 2019. You only have to go so far as the Steam reviews page to see just how much people love this game, and you'd be hard-pressed to find anything negative about it on YouTube outside of how poorly the Switch port performs. Regardless of how you feel about this game though, I hope you approach this video with an open mind and with the knowledge that criticism and hatred are not the same thing. I criticize because I care. So enough of me waxing philosophical, that's not what you're here for. Consider this as your official spoiler warning, and let's move on to Bloodstained. I want to begin with the presentational issues of Bloodstained first, because a lot of what I mention here will be many people's first impression of the game, whether they play it or watch it. Visually, Bloodstained is an absolute mess. Environments go from visually stunning one moment to covered in a thick coat of shiny plastic the next. The very first area you visit, the Galleon, is one of the absolute worst looking areas in the game once you go above deck and into the awful looking water textures of the rain falling onto the wood above. Inside looks fine, above deck looks terrible. In fact, any area in the game that calls for some sort of luster in the environment to make it look like what it's supposed to, you know, like ice caves or magma caves or damp caves, it just looks terrible. Like a college kid who just learned how to create a shader using specular reflections, hacked together the first thing he could and dumped it into the game, and gave us this. But I think that these shiny textures are just a symptom of an overall larger problem with this game's visual design. Now, I'm not inherently against 2.5D games. I think that they can look quite good, at least as good as some of the best 2D or 3D games given the right execution. And I totally get why 2.5 was chosen for Bloodstained. Castlevania games generally have a frankly insane amount of enemies, and for every new enemy that's added to the game, a new sprite and a new set of animations are required to give it life. Coupled with the sheer size of the castle and the large amount of different areas and backgrounds within it, the artists had a lot of work to do. I would have personally preferred pixel art, but I know that it would have taken way too much time and money. 3D models are just easier to make and animate. so I get it. But one clear advantage that 2D art can claim over 3D art is the way that it can mask poor lighting, or even make up for a complete lack of lighting altogether. Deliberate choice of color palettes can go such a long way towards setting a mood and implying a level of darkness for a given area. Think back to games like Super Mario World and its ghost houses. As clear as everything is, the place still manages to feel dark because of its color palette, its themes, and the simplicity of its visuals. In fact, I'd even go so far as to say that the limitations of the visuals in cases like this and Symphony of the Night allow the imagination to take over and make it look even better in our memories. 3D art just doesn't have that luxury. Unless it's very specifically designed to appear flat as a stylistic choice, then proper lighting plays a huge role in making 3D graphics look good. Take a look at this example of Half-Life 2's Ravenholm level. Even 15 years later, this level oozes atmosphere because of how well done the lighting is. Dark corners hide unknown threats, and you find yourself on edge as you walk through dark hallways, anticipating an ambush. But when you take away the lighting, most of this is lost. Everything is brightly lit, and it doesn't even look like the same area anymore, and the atmosphere is completely gone. Now, I'm not going to sit here and try to tell you that Bloodstained is the equivalent of Half-Life 2 without lighting, because that would just be a lie. But at times, it kinda does feel like it. I know this is supposed to be a magical castle and all, but why is every area so overly lit? Even the darkest areas in the game feel like they're blanketed by a series of floodlights like you'd see illuminating a sports stadium, as if the designers themselves were afraid of the dark. The backgrounds in Bloodstained are among the most detailed that I've ever seen in a game like this, and in theory, the 3D nature of them should add so much to their appeal. But because the lighting is so minimal and so lacking in these areas, or perhaps so overdone, the environments, with all of their depth, feel really flat. The interesting thing about this complaint is that one of the pre-release trailers that came out between the game's final release and the release of the initial demo is a before and after comparison of the game's graphics and lighting after receiving a lot of feedback about how bad the game looked. In fact, while a lot of the game does look better overall, I'd argue that some of these scenes look downright worse after the changes. First, let's look at the save room. You see this exact room everywhere, and while, yeah, it is harder to see exactly what is in the background, I think the intense silhouette struck by the ominous statue hidden in the dark background strikes an imposing figure that gives it a lot of character. What we got after the change is a brightly lit stage with fancy highlights all over the statue so you can see just how much detail it has. Granted, I don't think either of these is necessarily wrong or bad in this instance, but I do think that the first one strikes a much better atmosphere. Second is this outdoorsy, gardeny area. While the foreground of the old image is still overly lit, the background is dark and covered in ominous shadows, as I would expect from a game like this taking place at night and in a dark setting. I think what this needed was some love given to the lighting on the foreground elements so everything blends in just a bit better. Instead, they added more light and then draped a thick fog over the background, and applied a light blue-green filter over the whole area. As a result, the whole area feels much brighter. Again, not necessarily wrong, but I think I prefer the old one. And third is this arena where you fight Zangetsu. Again, it comes down to overexposure. This is the only one where I can confidently say that the old version looks vastly better than the new one. Not only is the new one super bright to the point where it looks like the actual sun is on the other side of the windows in the background in the middle of night, but the new one is missing all of the shadows that the old version had. The old one's still not perfect, a lot of the textures are still too bright, but the old version with its shadows just feels way more atmospheric and real. But hey, maybe I don't get it. Maybe it's supposed to be bright and colorful. Castlevania hasn't exactly been a dark game in the past, so why start now? The point that I'm trying to get to, though, is that I get very little atmosphere from the game. Part of it is due to how bright everything is, while another part of it is how visually messy the game can feel at times. From an NPC's insane head movements, to the galleon's disgusting water reflections, to Miriam's hair and scarf physics not really understanding what laws they're supposed to respect. They're all relatively minor things on their own, but they add up to what feels like an inconsistent mess that lacks cohesion in its style. And it's too bad too, because it's clear just how hard the artists worked on many aspects of this game. The sheer volume of rooms and backgrounds and enemies and animations and weapons and everything else that had to be made from scratch to give Bloodstained the scope that the developers wanted from it is immense. But I think that scope is the problem here. I wouldn't be surprised if the art team on this game were worked hard right up until release, just creating more and more things, rarely getting the time to polish and improve the overall look. It means that some of the cooler set pieces, such as the bell towers or the cathedral or the spiral tower or even the tiny big world, don't ever get close to their full potential because of the overall lack of polish throughout the entire game. Granted, a lot of this stuff is pretty small as far as complaints go, but they are so numerous and encompass such large swaths of the game that they add up in a really big way. Taking it all in at once makes the game feel like it was put together by some college students or developers and artists with relatively little actual work experience. It invokes an impression that the team is very clearly talented, but lacks the ability to really tie it all together in a way that complements the style and atmosphere that the game is going for. Unfortunately, the amateur feeling extends to the voice work as well. For the most part, I think that the cast does a great job with what they're given by Bloodstained's writing, but let's face it, the Castlevania games have never really been popular because of their stories, and Bloodstained's doesn't do anything to change that. You've got something cheesy and serviceable as a way to guide the player and the world forward and little more. But while I think the cast does well and their acting is fine, what really feels like it fell apart here is the directing, and in some cases, the casting choices. In an effort to keep this section from going on too long, I'm just going to go through my complaints on the voice work in more of a loose list. Erica Lindbeck does a fantastic job at portraying Miriam, except for the fact that her English accent is very hit or miss. She'll even slip into straight-up American on a few occasions, as demonstrated here.
Was this a village? What happened to it? Demons Gebel summoned?
I don't know if this was a casting mistake, overconfidence on Erica's part, or if the director just doesn't know the accent well enough to tell, but whatever it is, the ball was dropped pretty hard here. Look, I have nothing against David Hayter, but his involvement was marketed as far back as the Kickstarter campaign. His is a name that almost everyone knows, so the cynical side of me feels like some extra money might have been thrown at him just to get more eyes on the project. I think he does a fine job at portraying Zangetsu, but his voice as the narrator for the story in the beginning just made my throat hurt and wasn't very pleasing to listen to.
A horde of demons spilled from the shadows and fell upon city after English city. There was a message. The Alchemy Guild, fearing the rise of industrialism and abandonment by their wealthy patrons, had done the unthinkable to defend their existence.
As far as my complaints go, this probably is the most baseless and nitpicky of them. Shortly after you enter the castle, you're introduced to an old man whose past ties in with the main characters, and is framed as an antagonist at this point in the story. What follows is some of the most disconnected line reads in the whole game. Johannes here does a pretty good job, but Alfred doesn't sound like he's talking to anyone in particular. He just kind of angrily growls his lines in a way that, after knowing the rest of the story, feels completely tonally off for the character in this situation.
Enough, child. I am here for the book. Gebel has the book.
This feels like something that wasn't completely the actor's fault, and I make that assertion because of a very specific line that Alfred speaks in this scene.
Alfred, how are you still alive?
What were you thinking in coming here?
You can answer my question first.
All that matters is that I am alive. Did you come here for the book?
Hear how Alfred just kind of stops in the middle of his sentence and then remembers to finish it? Listen again.
All that matters is that I am alive.
Why is this the take that was used? As far as I'm concerned, the blame for this falls squarely in the director's lap. Issues like this make the whole game feel more and more like an amateur project. The callouts and battle reacts for this bloodless boss are some of the weakest and laziest sounding lines in the entire game.
Scarlet Thrust.
I'm fairly certain that she was supposed to sound seductive in her deliveries, just given the look of her.
I need more blood. Bloodstained.
But to me, they just sound weak and tired. Looking at the actress's IMDb page suggests the woman playing this character has quite a lot of experience, so I can't help but think that this is just another huge fail in the directing department. There are some downright awful accents in this game. Erica as Miriam may drop her English accent from time to time, but overall, it's not so bad. But listen to this
How do
bloke.
you grow?
Well, I haven't decided yet. Where are my manners? I'm Harry.
Miriam.
Tell me, Miriam, do you have anything I might be able to grow? Because if you let me do the farming, I'll give you your share of the harvest, and you won't even have to lift a finger.
It sounds like this actor learned a bad Cockney accent from Dick Van Dyke himself.
All right, ladies and gents, comical poem, suitable for the occasion, extemporized and thought up before your very eyes. All right, here we go.
Terrible job all around on this one. Susie is an old lady. Susie sounds like a woman in her mid-20s trying to sound like an old lady.
Yes, actually. But hang it all, I can't remember what it's called.
I'll help you figure it out.
Not casting or actor related, but some of the enemies have the most obnoxious death cries I've ever heard. When these big guys die, for example, they go, "Eee!" which by itself is okay, I guess, but as they despawn, the death cry is finished off with an "ooh." And it's the funniest thing in the entire game every time it happens. What, you thought I was exaggerating? Who thought this was a good idea? Also not casting related, but Miriam's attack sounds are incredibly annoying. They play with such a high frequency for a game where at least 50% of your time is spent hammering the attack button that you'll be really sick of it by the time you get halfway through the game. And if you're like me and have a habit of making the voice volume specifically higher than the rest of the game's sounds in most games you play, the world will be drowned out by Miriam's cries of aggression. I could probably keep going, but I think that'll suffice. A lot of this is very specific to the English acting in this game, so you can take it or leave it. But I think that a majority of players will play the game in English, and the amount of missteps that this game takes in its vocal performances and sound design occasionally fall into that so bad it's hilarious level of poor, and I don't think that's where any game truly wants to be. And finally, though I don't want to harp too much on the story here because, like I mentioned before, Castlevania was never really a game you'd play for the story, there are a few story beats that just don't land quite right. Characters who you'd imagine have no business wandering the castle end up in the most dangerous places. Dominique and Johannes will sometimes appear in rooms you visit for the first time to drop some hot exposition and then leave, causing you to wonder how the hell they managed to get through the hordes of monsters that you defeated to get there and spent so much time trying to get the correct items to be able to even get there in the first place. Dominique turns out to be a demon, of course, which makes her sudden appearances and her awkward idle stance make a lot more sense once you learn about that, but Johannes, he's supposed to not be very strong, right? And then there's this line at the beginning of the game where a character tells you that absorbing too many shards could cause the demons to overtake your body or something like that. But the line turns out to be empty and worthless. I, and many others based on my research, thought that this meant that some other gameplay elements would make themselves known as you collect more and more shards, causing you to have to balance either your shard usage or your shard collection. Neither of those is necessary, and this misunderstanding could have been avoided entirely just by not including that line. I didn't have much good to say about the game's presentation, but luckily the game's presentation isn't the most important thing when it comes to judging a game's worth. And in spite of what my title for this video might imply, I think that Bloodstained's main gameplay loop really nails the feeling of a proper Castlevania game. The weapon variety, the fabulous array of spells you can steal from enemies, the snappy and responsive movement, the animation canceling, the weapon special abilities, leveling up, collecting all sorts of equipment, it's all here, and it's pretty good. Regardless of all the things that bother me about Bloodstained, the core of the game is very solid and a lot of fun, enough to keep me playing through very nearly 100% map completion. Anyone who's ever played a Castlevania game in the past will feel right at home in Bloodstained, and I think that this on its own is more than enough to to make Castlevania fans happy, especially after such a drought over the past decade or so. I want to give a special shout out to some of the boss designs here too. Igarashi has stated that it was a requirement for his developers and designers who created a boss to be able to beat that boss with just a dagger without getting hit. Certainly a tall order for any developer who's creating a boss, but a requirement like this incentivizes the developer to create fair boss fights with good tells and reasonably avoidable attacks, which goes a long way in making them fun and avoiding the feeling of a cheap death. Doing all of the game's boss fights without getting hit is pretty difficult in itself, especially early on against Zangetsu and his quick sword swings and his tendency to punish your approaches. But after spending more time with these bosses, you really start to pick up on their attack patterns, and playing against them starts to feel pretty good. Though they're not all hits. As cool as the boss in the Clockwork Tower section is, it can be glitchy at times. And this ceramic hand boss is really stupid looking and also really easy to cheese. And this same Blood Witch that I complained about the voice acting for earlier, well, her health seems to be absurdly and ridiculously high for the point that you encounter her in the game, and I completely don't understand her Blood Rain ability. But hey, they can't all be winners, right? And something I didn't even know until I started my hard mode run is that you can get some kind of special little reward for defeating a boss without getting hit. For your trouble, you're given this neat little medal. Unfortunately, it seems that they do absolutely nothing, but it's at least a nice little trophy to prove that you did it. They might be required for 100% item completion though, which would be a bummer for any die-hard completionists out there. But I'm not really sure about that part. There's not really much to say about the gameplay itself in Bloodstained though. Like I said, it's pretty much your standard Castlevania fare, and if you like that, you'll like this. But while there isn't a lot to say about the core gameplay, I have a lot to say about all the systems surrounding it. We're going to begin with the game's inventory system, and in particular the way Bloodstained rewards you for exploration. If you've seen any of my previous videos about Metroidvanias, you'll know that I tend to be pretty critical of how a game rewards a player going out of his way to explore something that he doesn't need to. I think that if a game presents you with a relatively open-ended world, you want to be properly incentivized by the game to go down a non-critical path. If the reward is bad, the non-critical path ends up feeling more like a waste of time than anything else. In Castlevania games of the past, your rewards will usually be either a permanent health upgrade, a permanent energy upgrade, or more often, an item, whether it be a consumable or a piece of equipment. This is where things start to get a little bit awkward for Castlevania, in my opinion. Permanent upgrades are always very welcome finds. They're relatively minor, but over the course of the playthrough can add up significantly and make survival much more probable during tough situations. The items tend to be very hit or miss, however, and most of the paths that you'll end up going out of your way to explore will result in a piece of equipment or a consumable. Consumables can be great depending on how much you need a new healing item or some cash to stock up on potions, but they can also feel kinda bad considering if you use it, it's gone. Kind of a lame reward, but not so bad. Equipment can also be great because you might stumble upon a significant upgrade that'll make the next boss fight much easier. But the odds are much higher that the piece of equipment you uncover is a piece of garbage that you outgrew an hour or two ago. This is especially true when you decide to go back to earlier areas of the game that you haven't fully explored to collect some things you might have missed or otherwise unlock a path that you might have not known about. With rewards that are easily made obsolete just by having found a more powerful item in another part of the game, exploration starts to lose some of its excitement, and especially if you're gearing up for a big, strong late-game boss, you might even start to resent the fact that your exploration is turning up more garbage than not. Bloodstained, being a not-so-well-disguised Castlevania game, has the same exact reward system. I don't think any of us were expecting anything different. Luckily though, it manages to dodge most of the pitfalls of that reward system, and the ways that it does this I think are relatively simple. First, and your mileage may vary here because this is a highly subjective sentiment, Bloodstained, even on the normal setting, isn't the easiest game in the world, especially if you're not going out of your way to grind for materials or levels. I'm normally one to go straight for the hard mode difficulty on games because I've recognized that, over the years, normal modes in games tend to be way too easy for me, where hard ends up being just the right amount of challenge for me. Bloodstained didn't even let me choose hard mode for my first playthrough, and while I was upset at first, I began to understand why as I played. This difficulty is important because it makes consumables more important. If the game was too easy, you wouldn't ever feel the need to use your potions. If you didn't use your potions, you wouldn't feel the need to visit the shop to restock. If you didn't have to keep visiting the shop to restock, you wouldn't have much need for your money. And to wrap all of this together, The money winds up being extremely valuable in this game. All the way through to the end of the game, I found myself strapped for cash as I was constantly trying to buy food and potions to keep myself topped off for the tougher fights. Even the cheapest potions cost 100 gold, which surprisingly never becomes a completely negligible amount of cash. Money being valuable means that the shop is more important than ever, and that every spare item you end up finding as you explore, whether immediately useful or not, can end up being an important trading commodity to fuel your survival. And second, Bloodstained has a crafting system. I have more to say about this system later, but the way that it affects how you see the rewards that you earn through the game is extremely positive. In addition to consumables and equipment, you'll also find crafting materials inside treasure chests. These may be immediately useful to you, or they may not, but you'll rarely know that off the top of your head. Thinking on it, I believe this ambiguity is what makes finding a pile of iron ore feel better than finding a weapon that's too weak for you to care about. It could be useful, but you don't really know, so you might as well hoard as much of it as you possibly can. And even if you don't need it, sell it. It's a win-win. However, these two systems kind of step on each other's toes in a way. Crafting is hugely beneficial if you want to keep on top of the power curve in Bloodstained, and paired with the general overall difficulty of the game, it's an activity that you're going to want to engage with very often. But as you're combing through the recipes and trying to get a sense of what new upgrades you might be close to, you'll notice that some of the equipment and spell upgrade ingredients require another piece of equipment. I get why games do this, because in many cases it can be a logical progression of items or of power, but once I see something like this and realize that my old equipment might be useful for something, I immediately don't want to sell any of my old stuff. I've been burned by this in the past with RPGs, selling an item that's literally impossible to get a second copy of or is otherwise a nightmare to create, only to later find out that I need it to create some sort of ultimate weapon. So really this is on me, but I found myself refusing to sell items that were otherwise useless just in case I happen to find a recipe that makes it useful for me later. And as you can probably guess, this made me pretty poor. Weapons and armor sell for more on average than any spare crafting ingredients you pawn off, but with me being afraid to sell because the crafting system told me that I might need my old equipment later on, I found myself woefully underfunded for a majority of my playtime. It's not even simple to determine what you need to hold on to outside of looking through a guide or something, but even if there weren't an absolutely ludicrous amount of different things to craft and upgrade, you don't even have access to all of them right out of the gate. You have to find the recipe books for them hidden throughout the game. And do you want to be that guy who sells a useless sword only to find out that you needed it for a stronger sword later on? Yeah, me neither. That was a bit of a tangent, I guess, but the fact that Bloodstained has such an emphasis on crafting and looting crafting ingredients means that every drop and every treasure chest, even if it's just junk you want to sell, is meaningful and rewarding where it otherwise wouldn't be if the game didn't have crafting. Games like Castlevania Symphony of the Night, and especially the more recent Chasm, suffer from a lack of meaningful rewards to present the player who chooses to go out of his way to explore. I'm not trying to say that either of these games need a crafting system, just that it's one of the ways that Bloodstained addresses an issue that I think too many Metroidvanias tend to fall into. So the breadth of the inventory in Bloodstained makes exploration feel pretty good, but at the same time, I can't help but feel that that same breadth harms the game overall. Bloodstained is a pretty big game. There are 127 enemies, 126 weapons, over 11 different weapon types, many of which have a somewhat unique special ability, over 115 different ability shards, and I don't even know how many different pieces of armor, but I'd imagine it's over 102. Split over all of the different armor slots. Now take all of those items and remember that there's a crafting system, and realize that crafting systems tend to work off of base materials to make things, and, well, yeah, that's a lot of items. Throw in a bunch of cooking recipes on top of all of that as a means to replace potions in the long term, and wow, it's no wonder this game was in development for so long. But even with all of that time in development, I have to question the wisdom of having this much crap in any game, especially in what's essentially a brand new franchise. That's hundreds and hundreds of unique items that need to be created by artists and designers, and most of these items need to belong to the drop tables of one or more of the 127 different enemies. Additionally, almost every single one of these enemies needs to have a unique shard power that you can collect from them up to 9 times, each one powering up in a slightly different way, and each shard can also be upgraded using some of the items in the world, again up to 9 times. and most of the equipment needs to be craftable from these other items in similar ways. It's just too much, dude. There's no universe in which this amount of stuff doesn't result in a significant portion of it being completely worthless garbage. And that's precisely what ends up happening in Bloodstained, and honestly, that's not even the worst part of having this much quantity in a single game. Have you ever heard of the term analysis paralysis? It's a state of overanalyzing or overthinking a situation such that a decision or action is never taken. Paralysis may be a bit of an extreme term here, but when presented with this many options, it can be really difficult to make a confident choice. You have a limited set of resources, but here you are, asked to choose between up to 11 different weapons to spend them on. I mean, I know rapiers are fast and weak, but this one has poison. Is it worth choosing over the much stronger and much slower greatsword? Oh, but this spear occasionally petrifies enemies, but it doesn't offer the versatile animation canceling of this straightforward straight sword. Oh man, but kung fu boots are so cool! Ugh, I don't know which one to choose. The situation might seem a bit silly or overblown, but I see it as a real problem in Bloodstained because of just how many things you have to dig through once you acquire a few new recipe books. And the issues are compounded by the fact that the UI for these crafting menus is about as basic as can be. I think that if a few extra steps were taken to make the overflow of options a little easier to dig through, it would have gone a long way towards making the whole crafting experience feel a lot better. I mean things like sub-tabs for each weapon type so you can see a pared down list of what you want to see at the time, or options like the ability to tag weapons or armors that you want to craft so you can easily see your progress towards its creation while you're out in the world looking for materials, a shopping list of sorts. And speaking of materials, unless you're committed to using a guide outside of the game, figuring out which enemies have the material you want and knowing where to go to find them is a humongous chore. Luckily, Bloodstained has its archives, which automatically records each enemy you kill, the drop rate of each item you've witnessed those enemies drop, and where you can find said enemies. There is also, separately, a record of each item you've collected and which enemy or enemies dropped them. This all sounds completely wonderful, but there is a huge problem with it. Say you want to craft some awesome sword that you're eyeballing in the crafting shop. You manually write down the materials you need and the quantities that you need them because the game doesn't give you a hand there, but now you have to figure out where to find those materials. So you go into the items archive and scroll and scan with your eyes until you finally come across the item you're looking for, assuming you've seen it drop. Hope you don't scroll past it on accident because you were scrolling too fast and happened to miss it, otherwise you'll have to scan it a second or third time. This doesn't happen too often in this particular list though, since it's just a single column list. So you found your item and it tells you what enemies drop it. Great, write those down too. Now you've got to back out of the items archive, go to the demons archive, and search for the specific enemies you need so you can check their drop rates and see exactly which zones you can find them in. You'll be scanning this list much the same way you scanned the item list, but since this one is 2 columns instead of 1, it's much easier for you to accidentally gloss over what you were looking for if you're trying to scan through the list quickly, which you're likely going to try to do because there's just so many enemies and scanning through lists just is boring. And hey, I get it, what I'm describing sounds like the biggest first world problem non-issue in the world in a game that doesn't even necessarily have to include features like this, and I should be happy that these archives exist at all. But the fact that they do exist and the fact that it's just so cumbersome to use in a game that begs you to use it to get the most out of its crafting system drags the entire experience down. Again, a few extra features here would have gone a long way in making the entire system much easier and much more pleasant to use. Literally, all the developers would have to do here, and this can be done in a patch, is allow you to navigate to other archive entries from the entry you're at. Oh, I need some iron, but it's only dropped by these demons. Let me select those demons from this list of enemies that are known to drop iron so I can see the location and stats on that enemy without having to navigate away from the items list and search for it myself. This feature would be one of the easier solutions to implement, but it would have a profound impact on the way that you interact with what becomes a large part of the crafting system. As it is now, it feels like none of these systems were designed for the sheer quantity of stuff that you collect in this game, and the entire user experience suffers greatly for it. And that's not even to mention that these lists are missing a basic sorting feature. Just having that would go a long way in making the scanning portion of this issue much less of a problem. Instead, they're sorted by some monster ID, and you can't change that. When am I ever going to need to know that this demon in particular is number 69? Bloodstained has so much item content, but so much of it is poor and poorly implemented that it feels like more of a bragging right of being able to say that it has this many items to use and to craft. But so much of it can be thrown away without negatively impacting the game. Why does each shard need to be collected 9 times and upgraded 9 times to get the maximum effectiveness from it? Was the amount of enemies created truly necessary to fill out the game? What about the weapons? I know it's impossible, but I'd love to see some worldwide stats from everyone who's ever played this game and a percentage for each weapon, armor, and shard that shows exactly how many people in the world even used it, and on average, for how long. There's just too much that's too unnecessary, and it drags the game out through tedious menuing and an infuriatingly unskippable crafting animation. Depending on what you want to craft or which spells you want to upgrade to max, you're in for a very grindy time. Leveling up the yellow stat shards to max becomes pretty important though, because once you do, they become passive buffs without needing to ever equip them again. Of course you can for a bigger bonus, but you will now passively benefit from that power without having to worry about it anymore. And if you're doing a lot of crafting, to make it easier on yourself, you're going to want the passive shard that has a chance to give you bonus output from any of your crafts. But without going through the trouble to max that one out to make it truly passive, you'll have to remember to equip it every time you want to craft, since it doesn't otherwise buff your combat capabilities. Things like this feel required to be as efficient as possible with your time, but at the same time, unnecessarily tedious to interact with. Why couldn't this have been a truly passive thing from the get-go? As it is, you'll be forced to interact with the awful shortcut system more to equip it and unequip it. Either way, expect to spend a lot of time going in and out of a room to respawn enemies as you grind against them to get those drops that you need to level things up. And with so many things to craft and upgrade, true completion just can't be worth it. I'm not against grinding, and I think grinding can be a lot of fun, but this is just bad. There is a system to deconstruct items to help you get some of those more difficult to acquire materials, but again, it's not implemented very well at all. To deconstruct items, you need a specific amount of a material called alchemist. Only a very few specific enemies drop this material, and rarely at that. You could buy them from the merchant, but they're prohibitively expensive to buy in bulk, and you need more than one to deconstruct many of the items. It makes me wonder why this system exists at all, because I found very few opportunities to use this throughout the entire game. It just required too much time or money that I felt was better off used for some other more important goals. Since Bloodstained is a Metroidvania, I'd be a fool to not at least briefly talk about how the exploration and abilities complement each other. That's one of the core conceits of the genre, after all. Find a wall you can't pass, explore a different direction, then come back when you're able to pass that wall. I'm happy to say that, for the most of the game at least, Bloodstained's map feels remarkably fun to uncover as you go from room to room, trying to find your next goal. It's often easy enough to remember where you need to go when you find a specific ability, and even if it's not, there's usually some places that you haven't explored yet that you'll need to conquer. And the fast travel locations are abundant enough that you won't need to go too terribly far to get just about anywhere you want to go. Some genuinely good stuff here. I think that all Metroidvanias have at least one part of the game that's less obvious to figure out when it comes to progression though, and unfortunately, Bloodstained has a few really big missteps here. The first comes after you beat the towers boss and fall to the bottom of those towers. You'll pick up some material that, unless you already know what it is or spoke to the NPCs enough to know what you need, seems worthless. What you actually need to do with this is take it back to Dominique, who uses it to take your picture. And then you take that picture back to Definitely Not Dracula at his library to get a train pass, so you can finally go back to the train station to move on to the next area. I got stuck pretty hard here. I had no idea that the vampire librarian would give me a train pass. Why would I? The second is when it's time to enter the game's obligatory water level. You'd assume that, to get through this area, you'll find some shard in some other area that will allow you to sink or swim instead of being stuck at the surface, but you'd be really wrong. What you're supposed to do is go to this water zone and kill the monsters near the surface, until one just so happens to drop that one ability that you can get at this point that will propel you through the water. Then you have to hope that you didn't skip the text so that you can get the hint that it does propel you through the water. This one got a lot of people stuck, but I got lucky that my first kill gave me the shard, so I didn't have to flounder around for too long. The third is more towards the end. Once you get the power to invert the world, you'll need to go back to the towers area and invert there to fall to the top and get a special piece of armor that allows you to break spikes, which you'll need to get to a new area. You'd be forgiven for not even thinking to return to this place to invert, because it's pretty out of the way of just about anywhere else you'd want to be. I really think that this armor should have been hidden in a more substantial spot. Maybe in a new area or something. I can't tell you how underwhelming it was to even find it here. Just about every other required upgrade was found while exploring a previously unexplored part of the world and finding a special gem at the end or in the midst of a tough challenge. But this was just hidden out of the way in a spot that many people may not even think of checking. What's the point? And the fourth, and another one that got me pretty well stuck, is when you fight Zangetsu for the final time, he gives you his sword. This sword has the ability to break the illusion of the demon that's possessing Gebel. So you take that sword, you use it to fight Gebel, and you use it to save him from that demon. But after that, you need to go find another place in the entire castle that has a red moon so you can slice it and go to the next area. The reason I got stuck is because I hadn't passed through this red moon room in quite a long time. So I just completely forgot where it was. I completely forgot that that red room even existed. It's in a place near the beginning of the game where if you explore it enough, you won't find the need to ever go there again, so it would easily fall out of your memory. There may be a few more instances, but I can't think of any more right now, and I don't see the need to be completely exhaustive here. It's just more aspects of the game that needed more thought applied to their implementation, and that doesn't really end with just these 3 examples. There's a few different travel abilities and items that you use throughout the game, but a couple of them are just not fun to use. The ones that force you to go into the inventory menus to switch to them to progress are frustrating and halt the momentum of the game. The invert ability, while cool for the first few times, very quickly outstays its welcome as you're forced to watch the world spin over and over and over again as you explore. But at least you don't have to equip that one. Castlevania games of the past have included shortcut buttons to swap between 2 different sets of gear. I don't know about you, but I often kept utility in one set and my combat setup in another, because I always found it to be a chore to constantly keep more than one set of gear current, with as quickly as upgrades are found in these games. It just never felt worth the time for me. Bloodstained takes that a step further, but boy is it clumsy. You can save up to 8 shortcuts, at least once you find the shortcut slots, which are a ridiculously pointless permanent collectible upgrade spread throughout the game. You can copy your current equipment to a shortcut to always come back to it later, or you can edit each slot in each shortcut one by one. These allow you to switch loadouts on the fly, but boy oh boy, if you thought keeping 2 sets upgraded at all times was a pain, try 8. Again, I was lazy, so I just tried to keep 1 set for my combat gear and others for the various equipable abilities that I needed to traverse through certain areas of the castle, but it was still a pain to maintain. I often found myself using the shortcut to the wall bounce ability, for example, but I'd go back to the combat set of gear only to find that I hadn't updated it to my newest set of gear in over an hour. Now I've got to go back to my gear and manually change it all back, if I can even remember exactly what I was wearing. And God forbid if I ever accidentally overrode any of my sets with something I didn't want there. I appreciate the attempt with this shortcut system, but like the sheer breadth of items and spells and enemies in this game, it's also just too much. Too much complexity for something that should have just been simple. And better yet, how about it's just made completely optional and less of a joke by making all of the characters' travel abilities usable without having to equip them? Then maybe you'd have players be a little more willing to create sets for melee or for magic, for example. Otherwise, it's just too much of a hassle to have to maintain sets just to get around the castle efficiently. Up until now, everything that I've been talking about has been somewhat minor critiques in a large game that's otherwise a lot of fun to play and relatively satisfying to explore. For the most part, the systems surrounding Bloodstained's core loop of combat and exploration are where the most missteps lie, but that's more than enough to bring the game's overall experience down by a considerable amount. These systems may not be the core loop, sure, but secondary systems of a game are meant to complement the core in a meaningful and fun way, right? If a system doesn't complement the core, then you're left wondering why it exists in the first place. If a system is annoying to interact with but otherwise very useful or borderline required to use to progress, then it becomes very easy to become frustrated with the system or even start to resent it. And ultimately, I think that's where a lot of these secondary systems in Bloodstained land. The crafting, the quests, the shortcuts, the upgrading of your spells. Sure, you can get by without them, but the game is made much harder by doing so. But engaging with them asks you to waste a lot of your time on systems that really needed a little more time in the oven to increase their overall user experience. There's a lot of things that I'm critiquing about this title, and I think that any one or two of them on their own in an otherwise good game can be very easily glossed over in favor of the overall experience, but the uncooked secondary systems permeate every aspect of Bloodstained. And all of that is on top of the overly lit environments that are devoid of atmosphere, on top of the questionable voiceover work with poor accents and bad takes, on top of some of the unnecessarily obtuse progression points that you'll run into during the game. And all of it just gives off this impression of inexperience or of an amateur product, when it should be anything but. Remember, this game comes from Koji Igarashi himself, a nearly 30-year veteran of the gaming industry. This is a man who I'd imagine would have the expertise, the experience, and the know-how to get things done right, and one who I'd imagine would have the clout to bring in other talented veterans under his umbrella to create something incredible. What we got instead was a product that feels like it was cobbled together by amateurs who are new to the industry, who may have found themselves in over their heads. That might sound mean, but when you take all of my criticism of the gameplay and the aesthetics and combine it with the absolutely dismal state that the Switch port of this game was in on release, it doesn't sound that off base, does it? For those of you who don't know, Bloodstained was also released on the Nintendo Switch at around the same time as it was released on PC. Normally that's cause for celebration, and Bloodstained is a title that I think would feel right at home on the Switch. But unfortunately, the port suffered from many issues, including but not limited to poor frame rate, low quality textures, blurriness, unacceptable load times while traveling from one room to another, crashes, and a reported extra 100 milliseconds of input lag to top it all off. It's actually impressive how awful this port was, and, at the risk of sounding a bit dramatic, is a completely unacceptable and inexcusable state to ship any game in. On Halloween of 2019, a patch to fix these issues was finally pushed out. This is more than 4 months after the game was initially released. Assuming they had put enough people towards working on these issues, that speaks volumes for just how poorly put together the game is, that it would take that long to get it in a more playable state for the many people who practically wasted their money on the Switch version of this game. The game never should have been pushed out on the Switch in the state that it was. It's funny though, when I take a look at these before and after pictures for the graphical improvements that the Switch supposedly got, I don't see any difference in the fidelity between the images. The port was reportedly bad enough that I'd believe that there were improvements, but couldn't you have gotten a better before and after picture than this? Kickstarters are always a risk, no matter who is involved in creating the game. But when a popular name in the industry such as Igarashi is a part of the game's development team, it's easy to assume that the experience that they bring to the team and the project will help give the game that polished user experience and visual fidelity and design that makes games truly memorable. But that's not what we got. What we did get was a competently put together game that makes many mistakes that I wouldn't have expected from an independent team full of experience. A graphical style that doesn't have a clear mastery of color or lighting. An inventory system and breadth of items and spells and drops that goes a few steps too far into the overwhelming territory. A user experience that does very little in complementing the game's design choices. Questionable voice acting and weird story beats that make you question what you're even doing in this castle, and an embarrassingly bad port to top it all off. These are all things that I would expect an experienced development team to mitigate or even avoid completely. I think that the developers here are lucky that the game, at its core, is a fun experience. In spite of all my critiques and complaints, Bloodstained is a fun game to play from start to finish, and the sense of progression from beginning to end remains enthralling all the way through. Regardless of all the missteps, Bloodstained was a pretty good time. If you're a Metroidvania fan, or even just a Castlevania fan, you could do much worse than Bloodstained. I just don't think it's anywhere near the masterpiece that people make it out to be. I think what's happening with Bloodstained, at least in large part, is the fact that this game came from Igarashi himself. The big name behind all the Castlevania games that people love and have so much nostalgia for. And with this game being the spiritual successor of those Castlevania games and being such a tribute to Symphony of the Night itself with all of its Easter eggs, Bloodstained is being artificially elevated in the same way that any new mainline Zelda game gets a free pass from any Zelda fan just because it's a Zelda game. And to give games a free pass in this way, I think is harmful not just to the games themselves, but also to the developers who are responsible for those games. Critique is important for improvement, and I believe that there is something incredible that can be taken from the core of Bloodstained. I think if development was less focused on creating a lot of content, and more focused on polishing and cutting to create the best possible experience, the game could have been much better. But instead, it's simply just a middle-of-the-road experience that was made by the Castlevania guy and feels like a Castlevania game. And that's fine. If that's all you wanted, well, that's fine too. But I think that Bloodstained Ritual of the Night had the potential to be much, much more.